business, but he didn't have to build up a clientele. It was there. For the next few months, Stringfield did yeoman duty as Cincinnati's one-man UFO center by sifting out the wheat from the chaff and passing the wheat on to the Air Force. As he told me the other day, half his nights were spent in his backyard, clad in shorts and binoculars. Fortunately, his neighbors were broad-minded and the UFOs picked relatively warm nights to appear. Most of the reports Stringfield received were duds. He lost track of the number. The green, red, blue, gold, and white discs, triangles, squares, and footballs, which hovered, streaked, zigzagged, and jerked, turned out to be Venus, Jupiter, Arcturus, and an occasional jet. A fiery orange satellite which hovered for hours turned out to be the North Star, viewed through a cheap telescope, and the whole formation of spaceships were the Pleiades. Then it happened again. On the evening of March 23rd, Stringfield's telephone rang. It was Charles Deininger at the Mount Healthy GOC post. They had a UFO in sight off to the east. Could Stringfield see it? He grabbed his extension phone and ran outdoors. There, off to the east, were two large, low-flying lights. One of the lights was a glowing green and the other yellow. They were moving north. Airplane! This was Stringfield's first reaction, but during World War II he had made the long trek up the Pacific with the famous 5th Air Force, and he immediately realized that if it was an airplane, it would have to be very close because of the large distance between the lights. And as a clincher, no sound came through the still night. He dialed the long-distance operator and said the magic words, "This is Foxtrot Kilo 3-0 Blue." Seconds later, he was talking to the duty sergeant at the Columbus Filter Center. A few more seconds and the sergeant had his story. Another jet was scrambled, and this time Stringfield, via a radio-telephone hookup to the airplane, gave the pilot a vector. Stringfield heard the jet closing in, but since it was a one-way circuit, he couldn't hear the pilot's comments. Once again, the UFO took off. This was a fitting climax for the Cincinnati flap. As suddenly as it began, it quit, and from the massive data that was collected, the Air Force got zero information. In the Mystery League, the UFOs were still ahead. Although the majority of the UFO activity during the last half of 1955 and early 1956 centered in the Cincinnati area, there were other good reports. Near Banning, California, on November 25, 1955, Gene Miller, manager of the Banning Municipal Airport, and Dr. Leslie Ward, a physician, were paced by a globe of white light which suddenly backed up in midair while in Miller's airplane. It was the same old story. Miller was an experienced pilot, a former Air Force instructor and air freight pilot with several thousand hours flying time. Commercial pilots came in for more than their share of the sightings in 1956. On January 22nd, UFO investigators talked to the crew of a Pan American airliner. That night at 8:30 p.m., the Houston to Miami DC-7B had been a beam of New Orleans out over the Gulf of Mexico. There was a partial moon shining through small wisps of high cirrus clouds, but generally it was a clear night. The captain of the flight was back in the cabin chatting with the passengers. The co-pilot and engineer were alone on the flight deck. The engineer had moved up from his control panel and was sitting beside the co-pilot. At 8:30, it was time for a radio position report, and the co-pilot, Tom Tompkins, leaned down to set up a new frequency on the radio controls. Robert Mueller, the engineer, was on watch for other aircraft. It was 10, maybe 20 seconds after Tompkins leaned down that Mueller just barely perceived a pinpoint of moving light off to his right. Even before his thought processes could tell him it might be another airplane, the light began to grow in size. Within a short 6 seconds, it streaked across the nose of the airliner, coming out of the Gulf and disappearing inland over Mississippi or Alabama. Tompkins, the co-pilot, never saw it because Mueller was too astounded to even utter a sound. But Mueller had a good look. The body of the object was shaped like a bullet and gave off a pale, luminescent blue glow. The stubby tail, or exhaust, was marked by spurts of yellow flame or light. The size? Mueller, like any experienced observer, had no idea since he didn't know how far away it was. But it was big. One sentence, dangling at the bottom of the report, was one I'd seen many times before. Mr. Mueller was a complete skeptic. During 1956, there was a rumor, I heard it many times, that the Air Force had entered into a grand conspiracy with the U.S. news media to stamp out the UFO. The common people of the world, the rumor had it, were not yet psychologically conditioned to learn that we had been visited by superior beings. By not ever mentioning the words unidentified flying object, the public would forget and go on their merry stupid way. I heard this rumor so often, in fact, that I began to wonder myself. But a few dollars invested in martinis for old buddies in the Kitty Hawk room of the Biltmore Hotel in Dayton, or the men's bar in the Statler Hotel in Washington, produces a lot of straight and reliable information, much better than you get through official channels. There was no silence order, I learned, only the same old routine. If the files at ATIC were open to the public, it would take a staff of a dozen people to handle all the inquiries. Secondly, many of the inquiries come from saucer screwballs, and these people are like a hypochondriac at the doctor's. Nothing will make them believe the diagnosis unless it is what they came in to hear. And there are plenty of saucer screwballs. One officer summed it up neatly when he told me, "It isn't the UFOs that give us the trouble, it's the people." As a double check, I called several newspaper editors the other day and asked, "Why don't you print more UFO stories?" The answers were simple. It's the old dog bites man bit. 99% have no news value anymore. On May 10, 1956, the man bit the dog. A string of UFO sightings in Pueblo, Colorado hit the front pages of newspapers across the United States. Starting on the night of May 5th, for 6 nights, the citizens of Pueblo, including the Ground Observer Corps, saw UFOs zip over their community. As usual, there were various descriptions, but everyone agreed they'd never seen anything like it before. On the 6th night, the Air Force sent in an investigator, and he saw them. Between the hours of 9:00 p.m. and midnight, he saw 6 groups of triangular-shaped objects that glowed with a dull fluorescence, faint but bright enough to see. They passed from horizon to horizon in 6 seconds. The next day, this investigator was called back to Colorado Springs, his base, and a fresh team was sent to Pueblo. The man really chomped down on the dog in July, and the UFO really made headlines. Maybe it was because a fellow newspaper editor was involved, along with the Kansas Highway Patrol, the Navy, and the Air Force. Or maybe it was simply because it was a good UFO sighting. About the time Miss Iowa was being judged Miss USA in the 1956 Miss Universe pageant at Long Beach, the city editor of Arkansas City Daily Traveler and a trooper of the Kansas State Highway Patrol were sitting in a patrol cruiser in Arkansas City. It was a hot and muggy night. Occasionally the radio in the cruiser would come to life. An accident near Salina, a drunk driving south from Topeka, another accident near Wichita. But generally, south central Kansas was dead. The newspaper editor was about ready to go home. It was 10 o'clock, when the small talk he and the trooper had been making was brought to an abrupt finale by 3 high-pitched beeps from the cruiser's radio. An important all-cars bulletin was coming. 25 years as a newspaperman had trained the editor to always be on the alert for a story, so he reached down and turned up the volume. Within seconds, he had his story. The Hutchinson Naval Air Station is picking up an unidentified target on their radar, the voice of the dispatcher said, with as much of an excited tone as a police dispatcher can have. Take a look. Then the dispatcher went on to say that the target was moving in a semicircular area that reached out from 50 to 75 miles east of Hutchinson. A B-47 from McConnell Air Force Base at Wichita was in the area, searching. The last fix on the object showed it to be near Emporia in Marion County. The 2 men in the patrol cruiser looked at each other for a second or two. Like all newspaper editors, this man had had his belly full of flying saucer reports, but this was a little different. Let's go out and look, he said, fully doubting that they would see anything. They drove to a hill in the north part of the city where they could get a good view of the sky and parked. In a few minutes, an Arkansas City police car joined them. It was a clear night except for a few wispy clouds scattered across the north sky. They waited, they looked, and they saw. Shortly before midnight, off to the north, appeared a brilliantly lighted, teardrop-shaped blob of light. Prongs, or streams of bright light, sprayed downward from the blob toward the earth. It was big, about the size of a 200-watt light bulb. As the group of men silently watched, the weird light continued to drift, and for many minutes it moved vertically and horizontally over a wide area of the sky. Then it faded away. As one of the men later told me, "I was glad to see it go. I was pooped." The next morning, literally hundreds of people spent hours conjecturing and describing. After all these years of talk, they'd actually seen one. Several photos showing the big blob of light. 2 fishermen readily admitted they'd packed up their poles and tackle boxes and headed home when they saw it. Editor Coyne summed up the feeling of hundreds of Kansans when he said, "I have tended to discount the stories about flying objects, but brother, I am now a believer." What was it? First of all, it was confusion. Early the next morning, Air Force investigators flooded the area asking the questions: what size was it in comparison to a key or a dime? Would it compare in size to a light bulb? Was there any noise? As soon as they left, the military tersely announced that no radar had picked up any target, and no B-47s had been sent